Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for having me and for the invitation to speak this morning. As Sarah says, so I've been with Project Blue now for 6 months. I joined as their head of strategy towards the end of last year. My background is in market intelligence and pricing. Before joining Project Blue, I was actually at a battery startup, which I think is quite relevant actually to the discussion probably here today. Talking a little bit about my experience there in terms of being a startup in a very exciting space, however, wrought with, let's say, skeletons of those who have come before us and probably those that are going to come after us, unfortunately, as it is a very competitive and very high cost pressured arena. What I want to do today, I don't have many slides to share. I wanted to keep it brief as I know we have only 20 minutes, but I just wanted to set the scene, if you want, with just a couple of slides, just to give a little bit of a background to what I wanted to really focus on today. But as Sarah said, Project Blue, we're an international company. We're headquartered in London with offices in South Africa, China, US, and Australia. And we are a critical material intelligence provider through forecasting and analysis across most of your key critical materials with costs, consulting, and pricing. I'll just move on quickly to my next slide. So this is us, and this is our breadth of coverage. I won't spend too much on Project Blue. If there's ever an interest, please just reach out to me. I really want to get straight into it. I wanted to talk in terms of the dominance of supply and sort of the China's in terms of the concentration. And this is just a real map in terms of the percentage of the global market in 2025, in terms of mined, refined, and then demand. And what you'll see is there's a stark, overwhelming presence here of China really dominating most of these critical raw materials that we hear about and talk about and read about in the newspapers on a very regular basis. And not only just on the mine supply, but really in terms of the refined supply. And there's some extremes in this, right? So if you look at gallium is pretty much 99% refined by China, right? That's a huge domination in terms of a very critical material that's needed in your semiconductor materials, your aerospace and defense, and many other applications that are really core to today's technology and world in terms of progression and also society. But there are others, right, that we're very well averse to. In terms of lithium, China might not have the dominance in terms of mining, but they definitely have the dominance in terms of refined. What does that mean? That means that really the world outside of China is beholden and has an exposure to a single source. And how do we move away from that? And that's what we've been seeing really pretty much by governments making their critical material lists, by investments by the US government, by the European Union, Australia, and other countries subsequently. And how does that actually work? Well, obviously trying to get projects that are non-Chinese off the ground, and not always non-Chinese, I should say, right? That's not necessarily the issue. It's just making sure that there is less exposure to a single source of your material. I certainly found this when I was head of supply chain in my previous role, working for a US government where we had very strict laws to work under that we couldn't be sourcing Chinese origin supply. But when you're trying to source things like nickel and cobalt, that leaves you very, very limited. And what that means is that your cost pressures go immediately up because there's pretty much only a couple of names in town. What does that mean also in terms of if there are ever any geopolitical shocks, which we have seen in several of these markets? And I've picked out a few here. So I've looked at things such as germanium, yttrium, antimony, and tungsten. And if you look on the left-hand charts, you'll see the supply shocks that have happened as soon as there's an export control, an export ban, which we've been seeing over the last sort of several quarters. Prices spike. Reason being is obviously availability absolutely tightens, and that leaves you very limited material to actually get your hands on. The most extreme was definitely yttrium. Yttrium is a critical rare earth that's used in multiple applications in the West, and you can see it nearly had a over 2,000% price rise. It was almost worse than cryptocurrency. When you actually look at the other markets within the domestic China price, they did increase, but nowhere even near close to the same sort of standard. And that just shows as soon as Western buyers, if you want, Western consumers, we're absolutely hamstrung in terms of if this does happen, we have no other options. And if not on the right-hand side, it just shows you in terms of the critical material position and what happened as the export controls were in place. Now, there has been investments, right? There has been across the battery sector, across the EV sector, across the aerospace and defense, solar and wind, semiconductor sector of trying to grow regional supply chains, trying to expose other options, really. And this has been talked about for years. But unfortunately, there's been very little action. If you think about a mine, more people on this call will understand it better than I do. But if you think about it takes 10 to 15 years to bring a mine online. And that doesn't even mean that mine is going to be successful. Many of the investments that we see in the mining space actually never ever come to fruition. So that's problematic. The biggest issue I wanted to talk about today is cost pressure. Cost is a big consideration, of course, when investing in non-Chinese supply in terms of Western production. The issue you have is there is a natural delta in terms of the cost of production of producing a material within China or even South Korea or Japan than there is in Europe and the US. What that means is that your consumers, so your OEMs, no matter what sector they're in, have got a lot of cost. Well, they are cost conscious, obviously, so they are going to naturally flow towards the cheaper option if they are able to, because that is exactly what their mandate is as procurement teams. The issue you have is that that natural delta in terms of that cost of production means that many of these mines are not getting anywhere close to their cost of production price, let alone the incentive price. And I think that's really important to understand the two differences. There's a cost of production, but then there's an incentive price. The incentive price means we're above the cost of production and we hit a level where we can actually reinvest, we can expand, and we can bring more trains on, whatever production or whatever material that you're bringing on. And you can actually really be a genuine supply unit for that market. And that is the issue that we're seeing today. One thing also I wanted to talk about is that I'm going to stop sharing my slides. I just wanted to use these to set the scene. So just give me a second here. Have I stopped sharing?
Yep, you stopped sharing.
Perfect. Brilliant. My experience as was working as a startup, talking to my life before Project Blue. Again, a really exciting technology, US based, US supply chains for most of the parts. Anything else that we needed to bring in, we obviously had to bring in that was non-Chinese. The issue is that our cost of product was naturally higher, right? For any PCAM or CAM that was available from Asian markets. The issue that we had is that you are not competitive enough and we are not willing to pay a premium for your product. It wasn't a premium. And I think that is the biggest, I'd say, vernacular that's problematic today. There are natural deltas in the market. It's not about premium or trying to charge more. It's actually, this is the cost of production that we actually have, and this is the incentive price that we need to hit for us to be viable and for us to actually expand and reinvest and actually grow our business. There was nothing that was instructing OEMs to actually ensure that this material was taken on. So as much as we talk about regionalization, as much as we talk about securing supply chains and growing domestic supply chains, there is a disconnect. There's a big disconnect in terms of how much people are willing to actually pay for this to make this actually happen and take that to their bottom line, and how much are they actually willing to work with startups. And again, I really want to stress this. Majority of the markets that you're going to see having these new projects come on are not coming from the incumbents, right? They are investing, but they're mostly going through it through mergers and acquisitions. We're actually seeing very little in terms of new projects, right? So to get new projects on, it's usually a startup business that is, Series C or Series D funded, so quite well funded, but that money runs out very, very fast. And we need to have people signing on and having offtake agreements. And they need to be at a point where they can actually agree to the price that we are willing to give, right? So that's where the big issue that we came. And I found this quite irking at times because we're doing everything right? And I went through the whole, and I think what's relevant to this topic today, actually, in this event, is I was also looking after our responsible sourcing and our due diligence and our ESG practices. And while we wanted to do everything right, again, we're facing competition that is not using responsible material. Not all of them. I just want to stress that it's not all of them. This is just my personal view on the matter. But they were using products that were far less cost intensive than that we were, because we were sponsoring sourceable materials. But with that comes a price, right? And we're using that in our supply chain. Naturally, our end product is going to be more expensive. It's not that we're making any money, actually. If anything, we're incurring costs. But again, it's hurting the competitiveness. And another thing I just wanted to highlight as well is a lot of these startup companies, they have very little experience in responsible sourcing, in ESG practices, and what it actually means to actually have a proper due diligence or management system. I had to go through all of this. As a startup, you wear many, many hats. I was wearing a supply chain hat, I was wearing a commercial hat, and I was wearing the responsible sourcing hat. Many would argue I was probably marking my own homework. But at the end of the day, it was important. Obviously, the OEMs that we were speaking to said you need to have these practices, and that's great. We adhered to it. But that's a big wish list. You want a regional supplier, you want them to be low carbon, you want them to use fully transparent and ESG compliant supply chains, but yet you want them at Chinese prices. There's a disconnect there. right? And that's where I think there's a big misunderstanding in the market at the moment of how we actually going to get these projects off the ground. And while we can keep talking this and going back and forward and saber rattling with each other, unfortunately, the other supply chains get more concentrated and they grow even further, right? And we actually then put ourselves even further behind in terms of trying to catch that up. If you look at the EV battery supply chain in terms of the raw materials, we are absolutely streets behind. I'm talking in the West now. I'm talking about the European Union, anywhere outside of China, really. We are 10, 12 years behind where China is today. And unfortunately, at the moment, we do a lot of talking, but we don't do a lot of building. We don't do a lot of action. And the difference is that China doesn't talk much, but they build a lot. And I say that is the key difference between us and the rest of the market. So I just wanted to come here today to give you a bit of an insight into what it is like to be part of a startup, but also in terms of what we do here at Project Blue, in terms of mapping out these supply chains, mapping out these new assets, which are coming online, where the offtakes are coming from, and what those costs of productions are, and where those incentive prices are. The spot price is good. I mean, don't get me wrong. There's if you look at the spot price of rare earths or any of the battery materials in a European market or US market, it looks phenomenal. Right? That is not being produced, though, majority of that by any Western operation. The other issue that you have is you're looking at that spot price and thinking, oh, our cost of production is about a tenth of that. We could make a lot of money. The problem is that as more supply comes on, those prices are going to drop, and they're going to drop significantly. Right? That spot price is not reflective of where your price is going to be in a long-term offtake agreement. Right? So again, there's another disconnect. So this is the issue that we have in the raw material space when it comes to pricing, it comes to markets. You have your project. You have your idea of where you're going to be able to sell to, but then it all falls and crumbles, unfortunately. And that's where I think we're seeing a lot of these unfortunate companies we read about, unfortunately, quite far too often. They're just not surviving, right? They go through this really protracted valley of death, and they just don't get to see the light at the end of the day, and that's a real shame. But I will pause there, Sarah. So I just wanted, as I say, set the scene and hand over to you if there's any questions of anything there that I've highlighted.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, Scott. Well, firstly, thank you so much for that. A round of applause from all of us in our virtual spaces. Oh, brilliant talk. Thank you. And loads of questions. The first question is around, so we hear a lot of talk from governments, and we've had a lot of talks this week from different people who work with governments. And often a government will invest in, be it a startup or a project or something. And the problem is, of course, that startup or project, it's not commercial because they can't, for example, produce the metal or whatever it is at low enough prices to be competitive. And so as you're, I think, describing, it's like instead, actually what we need are the customers to be able to pay more for whatever it is that we're producing. And that's where the conversation gets very quiet.
Yes.
Because everybody just shuts up. Is there a solution there, or is it something that we just need to come at this from a totally different direction?
I think there's a shared pain that needs to happen, right? And I think I think that can't just be solved by industry, right? I think governments also have to step up. It's all well and good in terms of giving government grants, which was happening, right? In Europe and also in the US, government grants are a great way, and they definitely help projects get online and actually get off the ground. But then there needs to come something after that, right? You can't just be let alone to your own devices. OEMs themselves also need to recognize that if they are not showing that initial pain, and again, I just want to stress that's initial pain. It's not as if those costs are going to remain. As companies scale, right, and as efficiencies improve, and as technology improves, because you're able to invest further in your R&D and obviously scale, those costs come down. Right. So it's that initial shared pain that you just have to recognize. Yes, our cost of production is going to be higher, but we're sharing this, right? Most startups are not going to be, but they're barely going to be breaking even for their first period of life, right? So it's not exactly as if they are going to be raking it in and the OEMs are the ones that are suffering. It's actually quite the converse. They're living on a real knife edge, right? If they have one wrong, a bad issue in the plant or anything that goes wrong with the supplier, that they are living day to day at times. To be honest with you, not to be dramatic, but that is actually unfortunately the case, right? So I believe it's that shared responsibility and that shared pain, but you also need to have governments investing in other factors. I'll give you an example, right? So the US, there's at the moment a real push to build out raw material supply and raw material capabilities, but they're not thinking about the midstream. There's no point building a lithium refinery that's producing carbonate and hydroxide in the US and just shipping that back off to Asia, right? And then coming it back in a battery cell, right? How much of the steps of the value chain are we missing there? The other thing is if we're doing recycling of batteries, you're creating black mass, but you have no solvent extraction capabilities or no abilities to produce that into a PCAM or a CAM. Again, you're producing the black mass and then shipping it off. It's again, it's you're missing steps within that value chain. So I think that as an industry, we need to come together and understand exactly, okay, where are the key bottlenecks and how do we actually address those? And how do we share that pain, as I say, for a period of time until it's sustainable?
And just in terms of, so you mentioned, so as an industry, we need to come together. Who's going to coordinate that? Whose job is it to pull everybody together, or is it something that's just going to happen?
Good question. I think it has to be between the OEMs and the raw materials themselves. Government have to step in as well. You have got associations that are working incredibly tough circumstances in terms of getting this message out there. There has to be action. At the end of the day, as I say, we've done a lot of talking and not a lot of action. And again, some markets are better than others. I'm talking very, very generally here. So some markets are a little bit more ahead than others, but some markets we've seen little to no action at all. There has to be some form of governmental representation into this. I mean, that if you think of Europe, the European Union is slow, but it does move. And when it does move, it does get it done. But again, trying to grease the wheels of that and trying to actually get it rolling is probably your biggest hurdle. OEMs also need to be in the room, right? They need to understand, really be speaking to their suppliers, really understanding their pain points. Again, on the responsible sourcing side, a lot of the OEMs we spoke to, and again, somewhat, I'm talking very broad brushes here. Some OEMs they'll come to you and they'll say, we need you to have X, Y, and Z responsible sourcing initiative, this framework, etc. And you think about it, and you're like, oh, I don't know if we could actually do this, and I don't know how we would do this. Work with your suppliers, right? Work with your suppliers. Understand, that they are coming from this probably more, and again, from my experience, coming from a completely blind and actually not, and it's a completely it is a minefield when you're coming to this completely fresh of what do we want, what do we have to do? It's not that we're doing the wrong thing and we have to correct. It's the fact that we want to prove that what we're doing is correct, and we don't know how to do that correctly. Right. So therefore, you go through that whole field, and there's no one really there to actually guide you and help you. I'm really, I'd say, honored to see that there's a lot of consultancies now that are really excellent and really they understand where your position is and they understand the pain points that you have and are able to help you, and they've been fantastic. And there's also other companies within that space that are willing to share their knowledge and their experience. And I went through that experience. So that was a really good example of how industry can come together, where technically we are competitors, but we understand that, look, we both need to actually survive for this industry to actually take off, right? And they're willing to collaborate. So I think more collaboration, like I went through, was a fantastic example of how we can actually do this in a real sense.
One final question for you, Scott, and that's around, in terms of collaboration, so building on what you were just saying, and also as well kind of shifts in sectors, industries, markets, and what have you. Often we see big shifts when there are times of stress, and we're in that right now. I mean, my phone keeps ringing with organizations going, oh my goodness me, where are we going to get the helium, the sulfur, the whatever from, because it is stuck in a certain part of the world at the moment. And I think that's the case there. And we're all looking at the news right now. So of course it is Friday, the 1st of May. And currently we have a great big question mark over the Straits of Hormuz in terms of how long that might be shut for. And I think there are two things that are coming through. Firstly, what on earth do we do right now? Because this is beginning to have massive impacts across the world for the next few years. But then also as well, people saying we have to diversify our supply chains going forward. We cannot rely on that particular part of the world anymore. And we've seen this happen time and time again. With regards to that at the moment, are you seeing any big shifts in the minerals and metals commodities that are kind of trickling on from the Straits of Hormuz at the moment? Or what are you seeing in those data sets? And I think as well, then anticipating the future where people are going, okay, we do need to diversify. Are we seeing active change now, or are people still there going, oh, it's okay, we'll get our yttrium somehow?
Yeah, I'll answer that question in two ways. The first way, yes, the practical sense, yes, we're really seeing impacts in the markets, particularly with the Strait of Hormuz. The biggest one I would say is obviously shipping costs and ocean freight costs and everything that's going up in terms of diesel and petrol. Right, we're going to potentially start seeing shortages in some key areas where trucking costs is going to go through the roof. Again, who's going to swallow those costs? Is it going to be the consumer, or is it going to have to be borne by the producer? So there is a lot of cost pressure that's happening right now across the commodity world. As you mentioned, on the sulfur side, I don't think that's even been realized yet in terms of how much that's going to affect refining, right? And actually, there's going to be a drop in supply in some of these key critical materials. So the longer this lasts, the inflationary pressure that this is going to have on markets is going to be significant. So undoubtedly, we will have to see something's going to have to give in terms of where commodity prices are, and really that's pretty much across the board. In terms of what you're talking about in terms of a crisis points and the need for diversification, this is a new example in terms of what's happening today, but there's been countless other crisis points in the past, and there undoubtedly will be further crisis points in the future. It's at that crisis point that people say that. They say, well, we need to diversify. How did we get ourselves in a position where we are reliant on one source or one bottleneck? Unfortunately, what happens is the crisis subsides and people have very short memories. So people can be very myopic when these things happen. And don't plan really for the future. And that's sort of that urgency and that sort of that fear and that sort of anxiety that right now this sort of situation is causing, that subsides, that goes into a far distant memory. And that need and that urgency to invest and to actually make sure that they shore up their supply chains, unfortunately falls away with it. And that's what we keep saying. So, the question is actually, how do we continue that sense of panic or that sense of anxiety, right? So maybe how do we change about it and change your mindset and say, well, we need to be more strategic about this and we need to be thinking more about the future. It's a really tough question, but unfortunately, history is a cruel storyteller, and that's what we've seen countless times.
Brilliant. With that, thank you so much, Scott. As always, absolutely brilliant.